The old man's eye was swollen shut, purple bleeding into yellow across his cheekbone, and every single person in that diner had already decided he deserved it. Nobody asked. Nobody looked twice, except for the whispers behind coffee cups. The theories traded like currency. Then a biker walked in, leather-clad and silent, and did something nobody else in 6 years had done. He sat down, uninvited, across from the man everyone else had already judged and moved past. What he didn't know yet was that the bruises weren't from a fall or a fight or anything the old man had earned. Someone inside that house had been hurting him for months, and no one had noticed at all. James Whitfield had been coming to the Sunrise Diner on East 11th Street every morning for the past 6 years, always at 6:45, always alone, always to the same corner booth by the window. The regulars set their watches by him. Marge, who'd worked the counter since before the diner got its new sign, could have his order ready before he sat down. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter. This morning was different. This morning, James walked in with his left eye swollen shut, a deep purple bruise spreading across his cheekbone like a storm cloud. The diner went quiet the way rooms do when everyone notices something at once, but nobody wants to be the first to say it. Marge's hand froze over the coffee pot. A trucker in a faded Route 66 cap lowered his newspaper an inch, just enough to look over the top of it. 2 women in the booth by the register leaned toward each other without turning their heads. James didn't acknowledge any of it. He walked to his booth with the same careful, deliberate steps he always used, the gait of a man whose knees had given him trouble since Nixon was in office, and lowered himself into the seat facing the door, like he always did. Marge brought the coffee without a word, though her eyes lingered a half-second too long on his face before she caught herself and looked away. "Thank you, Marge," James said, his voice steady, giving away nothing. She nodded and retreated to the counter, where the whispering started before she'd even set the pot back on its burner. "Probably fell," said the trucker, not quite quietly enough. "Old men fall." "That's not a fall," said one of the women by the register, a nurse named Carol, who worked the early shift at St. Francis. "That's a fist. I've seen enough of them to know." "Maybe he had it coming," muttered someone else. Nobody could say for certain who, and nobody wanted to claim it. James stared out the window at the grey Tulsa morning, at the traffic beginning to thicken on 11th, and said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that silence cost less than explanation. Explanation invited questions, and questions invited more questions, and eventually you'd have to say the thing you didn't want to say out loud, in a diner, over eggs. He ate slowly. He always ate slowly now. His hands weren't what they used to be, and the tremor in his right one had gotten worse over the winter. He'd started favoring his left, though it wasn't much steadier. 74 years old, and James had built a life out of showing up. He'd shown up to the tire plant for 31 years before it closed, and took his pension with it into something smaller than what he'd been promised. He'd shown up to bury his wife Doris 4 years ago, standing at the graveside in a suit that had gotten too big for him because grief had taken more weight than the doctors ever could. He'd shown up to this diner every morning since, because the alternative was an empty house on Yale Avenue that echoed when he coughed. He did not show up to be looked at like a mystery to be solved, or worse, a problem to be avoided. The door chimed. James didn't look up. He never did. Not for the door. But the diner's temperature seemed to shift the way it does when someone with a particular kind of presence walks in. Daniel Kowalski stood just inside the entrance, 6'2" in a scarred leather jacket, a grey-streaked beard, and forearms marked with faded ink that told the story of a man who'd been a lot of places doing a lot of things nobody had asked him to explain either. He scanned the diner the way he always did, force of habit from 22 years in the army, 4 of them in places he didn't talk about, and his eyes landed on James. Then, without asking Marge, without hesitation, Daniel walked straight to the corner booth and sat down across from him. James looked up, startled. "This seat's taken." "By who?" Daniel said. "Looks like an empty seat to me." "I sit alone." "Not this morning." Daniel picked up the laminated menu without looking at it. "Marge, I'll have what he's having and coffee, black." Marge, who had frozen mid-step halfway to the booth with her own coffee pot, blinked. "You two know each other?" "We do now," Daniel said. James studied him, the leather cut with a patch that read Steel Riders MC on the shoulder, the calm and unbothered way he'd claimed the seat like it was the most natural thing in the world. James had noticed the man before, actually. He rode a big matte black Harley that idled outside sometimes when Daniel stopped for coffee to go, never staying, never sitting. "You don't have to do this," James said quietly. "Do what?" "Sit with the man everyone's staring at." Daniel glanced around the diner, at the trucker who quickly buried himself back in his newspaper, at the two women who suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. "Looks like they're staring at both of us now," he said. "Guess we're even." For the first time in longer than he could remember, James felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly. Not quite a smile, but the muscles that made one possible. "Steel Riders," James said, nodding at the patch. "I've seen you boys around. Thought you all rode for trouble." "Some days," Daniel said. "Mostly we ride for coffee. Trouble's overrated once you hit 40. Marge set down Daniel's plate, still watching the two of them with the wary curiosity of someone trying to figure out a puzzle that had just gained a piece she hadn't expected. "You didn't ask," James said, once she'd gone. Meaning the I. Meaning the question every other person in the room was dying to ask, and too polite or too cowardly to voice. Daniel forked into his eggs. "Didn't figure it was mine to ask. You want to tell me? You will. You don't. That's fine too." Either way seemed like a man could use some company that wasn't made of stairs. James looked at him for a long moment, then out the window again, where the morning traffic had thickened into the steady grind of a city waking up around people who had no idea what any of it cost. "Maybe," James said. "I will. Not today, but maybe." "I'll be here," Daniel said. "Same seat, if you don't mind." For the first time in longer than James could name, breakfast didn't feel like something to survive. Daniel came back the next morning, and the one after that. By the second week, Marge had started setting 2 coffees on the table before either man sat down, and the whispers at the counter had shifted from suspicion to something closer to bewilderment. Nobody quite knew what to make of the old man and the biker, who now shared a booth every single day like it had always been that way. James's bruise had begun to fade to a sickly yellow-green by the second week, but a new one appeared on his forearm the following Monday, and Daniel noticed it the way he noticed most things, without comment, filing it away. It was on a rainy Thursday morning, water sheeting down the diner's front windows, that James finally started talking. Not about the bruises, not yet, but about Doris, about the tire plant, about the 2 daughters who'd moved away, one to Denver and one to Phoenix, both calling less than they used to and both, in their own ways, worried about him from a distance that made the worry easier to carry and harder to act on. "You got people checking on you?" Daniel asked. "I got a neighbor," James said. "Ronnie, young fellow, moved in next door about a year back after his own place fell through, renting from the Delgados down the block while he gets back on his feet, or so he says. Nice enough. Comes by sometimes." Something in the way James said "comes by sometimes" made Daniel set his fork down. "How often sometimes?" "Often enough." James's jaw tightened, and he looked down at his coffee like it had suddenly become very interesting. "He helps me out. Groceries sometimes, fixed my gutter last fall. That's decent of him." "It is," James said too quickly. Daniel let it sit. He'd learned in the army and after that some doors you didn't kick down. You waited by them until the person on the other side decided to open them himself. He changed the subject, and James seemed grateful for it, and they talked instead about the Steel Riders' upcoming charity run for the Children's Hospital, about a bike Daniel was restoring in his garage, a '78 shovelhead that fought him every step of the way. But over the following 2 weeks, Daniel started noticing things he couldn't unnotice. James wincing when he reached for his coffee cup, favoring his ribs. James mentioning, almost in passing, that Ronnie had borrowed his truck again and brought it back with an empty tank. James's hands, when Daniel really looked at them, shaking worse some mornings than others, not the steady tremor of age, but something that looked almost like flinching, like a man bracing for a hand that might come down on him. The diner regulars had their own theories, whispered over coffee refills. Carol, the nurse, thought it was a fall, arthritis maybe, a man too proud to use his cane. The trucker thought old James had gotten into it with somebody at a bar, though nobody could picture James Whitfield in a bar in the last decade. Marge, who saw more than she let on, had started quietly saving James's leftover pie for him to take home, the way you do for someone you suspect isn't eating well when nobody's watching. Nobody asked James directly. That was the strange cruelty of it. An entire diner full of people who noticed, who theorized, who judged, and not one of them, before Daniel, had pulled up a chair and simply sat with him. It was Marge who finally said something to Daniel, cornering him by the register one morning while James was in the restroom. "I don't like it," she said, voice low. "That neighbor of his. I've seen him drop James off out front a few times, practically shoving him out of the truck. Once I heard him yelling before the door even shut. Yelling about what? Money, I think, or James not signing something." Marge glanced toward the restroom hallway. "James doesn't talk about it, but I've been doing this a long time, Daniel. I know what a man looks like when somebody's got their thumb on him." Daniel felt something cold settle low in his gut, the old familiar clarity that came before he made a decision he wasn't going to walk back from. "You said his name's Ronnie." "Ronnie Pratt. Rents from the Delgados on Yale." James emerged from the hallway, and Marge busied herself with the coffee pot like nothing had passed between them. Daniel sat back down across from his friend, studying him with new eyes. The careful way James moved, the bruise pattern that didn't quite match a man who lived alone and fell sometimes, the flinch when the door chimed too loudly. "You all right?" Daniel asked. "Fine," James said, the same word he always said, worn smooth from overuse. Daniel didn't push, not yet. But that night, after he closed up the garage, he made a call to a buddy from the Steel Riders who did some work for a property management company, and asked him casually if he knew anything about a Ronnie Pratt living off Yale Avenue. What he heard back 3 days later was enough to make him lose sleep. Ronnie Pratt was 32 years old, and according to Daniel's contact, he had 2 prior arrests, one for a bar fight in Bixby, one for check fraud that had gotten pled down to nothing serious. He'd moved into the rental next to James almost exactly a year ago. Right around the time, Daniel realized, after checking dates against something James had mentioned in passing, that James's arthritis had started making it hard for him to manage his own finances, hard to drive at night, hard to keep up with the yard. Ronnie had made himself indispensable slowly, the way people like that always did. First, it was small favors, mowing the lawn, a ride to the pharmacy. Then it became James, signing a few papers Ronnie said were just permission slips for repairs on the house. Then it became Ronnie holding on to James's checkbook to make things easier, and James's monthly Social Security direct deposit somehow never quite covering what it used to. Daniel didn't have proof of all of it yet, but he had enough of a picture to feel sick about it, and enough restraint, barely, not to drive straight to Ronnie's door and settle it the way 22 years of training told him he could. Instead, he went to James. He found him on his porch on a Saturday afternoon, sitting in an old wicker chair with a blanket over his knees, despite the mild October weather, staring at nothing in particular. The house behind him was modest, but well kept from the outside, flower beds gone a little wild, gutters that needed clearing, the kind of small neglect that told a story if you knew how to read it. "Didn't expect you outside the diner," James said. "Wanted to check on you." Daniel sat on the porch step, not asking permission. The way he'd learned worked with James. Showing up mattered more than asking. "You look tired." "I'm 74. Tired's the baseline." "That's not what I mean." Daniel turned to face him fully. "James, I need you to be straight with me. The bruises, the shaking hands. Is it Ronnie?" The silence that followed was its own answer, stretching long enough that a dog barked somewhere down the street and a car passed, and neither man moved. "It started small," James finally said, voice barely above the wind moving through the dying leaves. "Just him getting frustrated. Grabbing my arm too hard when I couldn't sign something fast enough or couldn't remember where I put a document he wanted. Then it got worse. 3 weeks ago, he shoved me into the counter when I told him I wanted to see the bank statements myself." James's hand, resting on the blanket, had begun to tremble. The eye. "That was 2 weeks ago. I told him I was going to call my daughter, tell her what he'd been doing with my accounts. He didn't like that." Daniel felt his jaw tighten so hard it ached. "Why didn't you say something? To me, to Marge, to anybody?" "Because I was ashamed," James said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that undid something in Daniel's chest. 74 years old, worked my whole life, buried my wife with dignity, and I let some kid half my age walk into my house and take it apart because I was lonely enough to let him in. You think I wanted anybody to see that? You think I wanted the whole diner looking at me like I was some pathetic old fool who couldn't take care of himself? You're not a fool," Daniel said. "You're a man who trusted somebody, and he took advantage of it. That's not the same thing. Try telling that to the folks at the diner. I saw how they looked at me that first morning, like I'd gotten myself into some bar fight I deserved." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I saw it too. And for what it's worth, I think most of them feel like hell about it now, whether they'd say so or not." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But James, this isn't about what the diner thinks anymore. This is about getting Ronnie out of your life and your accounts before he does worse than a bruised eye." James's hands twisted the edge of the blanket. "I don't know how. He's got my checkbook. He's got me convinced I need him. Who else is going to help me with the house, with the bills, at my age?" "I am," Daniel said simply, "and the steel riders, and Marge, and probably half that diner if you'd let them. You've got more people in your corner than you think, James. You've just been sitting alone so long, you forgot how to let anybody sit with you." James looked at him for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes. Not quite relief, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had been holding for a very long time. "What do we do?" he asked. "First thing," Daniel said, "we call your daughter, tonight. Then Monday morning we go to the bank together and you put a freeze on anything Ronnie can touch. And we call the police about those bruises because grabbing an old man hard enough to leave marks is assault, whatever he wants to call it. And if he doesn't take it well?" Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his voice went flat and certain in a way that left no room for argument. "Then he'll have to take it up with me, and I promise you, James, that's not a conversation he wants to have." The plan moved fast once James agreed to it. His daughter Sandra flew in from Denver within 2 days, shaken and guilty in the particular way adult children get when they realize how much they'd missed from a distance. The bank froze the accounts Ronnie had access to the moment James walked in with his passbook and his ID, a teller named Angela listening with quiet professional fury as James haltingly explained what had been happening. The police report was harder. James sat across from a young officer named Detective Reyes in the Whitfield living room, describing the shove, the grabbed arm, the night with the swollen eye, his voice steadying more with each sentence, like naming it out loud was slowly returning something to him that Ronnie had taken. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Pratt," Reyes said. Given his priors, if this pattern holds up, we're looking at elder abuse and potentially financial exploitation charges. That's serious. It was serious enough, in fact, that Ronnie found out before the police got to him. Daniel suspected, though never proved, that Ronnie had eyes on the comings and goings at James's house and had clocked the patrol car in the driveway. Whatever the reason, Ronnie showed up at the house himself that same evening before Reyes could return, pounding on James's front door hard enough to rattle the frame. Daniel had been there, as he'd promised he would be every evening until this was settled, sitting with James at the kitchen table over decaf and a plate of Marge's saved pie. He was on his feet and at the door before James could even rise from his chair. Ronnie stood on the porch, sweating despite the cool evening, his eyes wild in a way that told Daniel everything he needed to know about how the last few hours had gone for him. "Where's the old man?" Ronnie said. "James, I know you're in there. You've froze the accounts. You have any idea what you just did to me?" "He's not coming to the door," Daniel said, stepping fully into the frame, filling it. "But I am. So say whatever you came to say to me instead." Ronnie's eyes flicked over Daniel's size, his leather cut, the calm that radiated off him like heat off asphalt. Something in his posture deflated slightly. The bluster of a man who'd built his power on an old man's fear meeting something that fear didn't work on. "This isn't your business," Ronnie said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. "You put your hands on a 74-year-old man," Daniel said, low and even. "You stole from him. You made him too scared to tell the people who loved him what was happening in his own house. That makes it my business, and every friend that man has, and pretty soon it's going to be the Tulsa Police Department's business in a much more permanent way." "He signed everything I asked him to sign," Ronnie said, some of the old confidence trying to claw back into his voice. "Willingly. Nobody forced him." "You grabbed his arm hard enough to leave a mark for showing hesitation over paperwork," Daniel cut in. "You put your fist near his face until he stopped asking questions about his own bank statements. There's a word for that, Ronnie, and it isn't willingly." From behind Daniel, James's voice came, steadier than it had sounded in weeks. "I want you off my property, Ronnie, and I want everything you have of mine back. The checkbook, the truck title, all of it. Detective Reyes will be by tomorrow to collect a formal statement, and I intend to give her every detail." Ronnie's face cycled through several expressions: anger, calculation, something that might have almost been fear, before he settled on a scowl aimed somewhere between the two of them. "This isn't over," he muttered, but he was already backing off the porch, already beaten in the particular way that men like Ronnie get beaten, which is by finally being seen clearly by someone who refuses to look away. "It is, though," Daniel said, watching him go. "It really is." He waited on the porch until Ronnie's car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, then stayed another hour after that, just in case, before finally going back inside to find James sitting at the table, staring at his own hands like he was seeing them for the first time in a long while. "They stopped shaking," James said quietly. "First time in months." Daniel sat back down across from him. "That's what happens when the thing you're afraid of finally leaves the room." Ronnie Pratt was arrested 11 days later, charged with elder financial exploitation and assault, following a formal statement from James and corroborating testimony from Marge about what she'd witnessed outside the diner. Sandra stayed in Tulsa for 3 weeks, helping her father untangle the financial mess Ronnie had left behind, and though she eventually had to return to Denver, she called every single day after that, no exceptions, and flew back twice more before winter's end. The Steel Riders, once they heard the full story from Daniel, took it upon themselves to check in on James the way a family does. Big Pete stopped by to finally fix the gutters that had needed it since fall. 2 of the younger members mowed his lawn without being asked, and the club's monthly charity run added a stop at St. Francis Hospital's Elder Care Wing, a cause that hadn't been on their list before but felt now like exactly where it belonged. The diner changed too. in its own quiet way. Word had gotten around, Marge saw to that, in her careful, unhurried way of setting a story straight over coffee refills, and the whispers that had once trailed James across the room transformed into something else entirely. Carol, the nurse, started stopping by his table most mornings to ask how he was doing, genuinely, not out of curiosity, but out of something that looked a lot like care. The trucker who'd once muttered about old men falling brought James a get-well card, gruff and awkward about it, the kind of gesture that costs a certain kind of man more than it looks like it should. 6 weeks after that first rainy morning when Daniel had sat down uninvited, James walked into the Sunrise Diner and found the corner booth already occupied, not just by Daniel, but by 3 other members of the Steel Riders, squeezed in around the table with an extra chair pulled up from the next booth over, waiting for him. "Figured the booth could use some expanding," Daniel said, sliding over to make room. "Man's got more friends than table space now. Good problem to have." James stood there a moment looking at the crowded table, at Marge already pouring his coffee with a smile she didn't used to give him, at the diner around him that had once made him feel like a curiosity and now simply felt like a place he belonged. "You didn't have to do any of this," James said, settling into the chair, his voice thick. "Yeah, we did," Daniel said. "That's kind of the whole point." James looked around the table, at Big Pete's weathered, kind face, at the 2 younger riders arguing good-naturedly about motorcycle parts, at Marge refilling coffee cups without being asked, at Daniel across from him, the same man who'd sat down in a stranger's booth on a morning nobody else had dared to. He thought about the swollen eye that had once made this room go quiet with judgment, and how it had, in the strangest way, ended up bringing him more family than he'd had in years. "People used to look at me and see somebody who'd gotten what he deserved," James said quietly, "somebody easy to look past." "People are going to look at all sorts of things and get it wrong," Daniel said. "The trick is finding the ones who'll pull up a chair and find out the truth instead." James picked up his coffee cup. His hand, for the first time in longer than he could remember, was completely steady. "Well," he said, a small smile finally breaking through, the first real one the diner had seen from him in longer than anyone could say. "Pull up a chair then. Orders on me."